I don't know what just happened, but so we're going to take a look here on the bottom of Lamed Dalet Amud Beis, and we're counting up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom.
Okay.
Okay, then, so we're on Lamed Dalet Amud Beis at the bottom of the Amud. We had learned in our Mishnah that if a man marries 2 women, and at the time that he entered into the chuppah, there was a mix. I mean, 2 men married 2 women, and at the time of the chuppah there was a mix. Then you need what's called hamtana, so that a woman can't get remarried until she waits 3 months since the termination of her previous marriage, or for that matter, since she had a relationship with another man. And the reason for that is called havchana, because we want to make sure that we know whether the child is from the first boel or from the new husband. So we have to separate by 3 months. Omar Shmuel, v'chulan, all women who had such a relationship and they could get pregnant, and even if they can't get pregnant, once they got a divorce or they were widowed and they want to get remarried, tzrichos lahamtin shlosha chadashim, utz migiyores u'mishuchreres ktana. So that Shmuel says the following: even though in general a ktana could not get pregnant and survive it, we still have a uniformity halacha, and whatever halacha applies to a gedola, oh, now you're okay, applies to a ketana as well. However, the exceptions are a giores or a mishuchreres. So we're now talking about a non-Jewish girl, and she became a giores at a young age, before she became gedola. And that's based on a sugya in Ksubis called Ger Katan Matbilino Soal Das Bezdin on Daf Yudal. Then we have Mishuchreres, let's say a girl who was sold by her father as a shivcha, and her master gave her a get shichur, and she's also gioris after she receives a get shichur. In those 2 cases, since they're kanos and they cannot become pregnant, then immediately after the giur, or immediately after the shichur, they can get remarried. And we don't have to apply the principle of hamtan. Now, the implication is that other kanos, other than these 2 very rare cases, would require avchana. Aval ketana bas Yisrael, even though she cannot get pregnant, we still need a hamtana period before she can get remarried of 3 months. So the Gemara asks, Ubemai, how would it be that a bas Yisrael who's less than 3 years old would terminate her marriage relationship? If we're talking about a case where she was married off not by her father, but by her brother or her mother, which is called Kedusha Miyun, Kedusha D'Rabbanan, and she simply is Mima'enes, she declares, I'm not interested in this marriage, and she could walk out of this marriage. Is the Gemara asks, if that's the case where Shmuel told me that she needs Tamkana, because she's a Ketana Bas Yisrael, or Amar Shmuel Loboy. Shmuel, as we'll soon see, is quoted on record as saying that in the case of a Ketana after Miyun, she can get married immediately. She doesn't have to wait. And the reason for that is that there's no Gzeira of Ketana Atu Gedola, because there's no such thing as Miyun in Gedola. So the entire enterprise of Miyun has no parallel, no application to the case of a Gedola. So to say that we could make a Gzeira of Ketana to Gedola means that the situations are identical except for the fact that one is less than 12 years old, the other is more than 12. That's not true in the case of Miyun. So that's Shmuel's position that if a Ketana was married off by her brother and now she's Mema'enet, she can get married immediately. So in what scenario did Shmuel require Hamtan of Gimel Chadashim for a Bas Yisrael Ketana? The beget, so that's fine, because if this 3-year-old girl who was married off by her brother receives a get, that's exactly identical to the situation of a Gedola, barring the difference that a Ketana is a Ketana, Gedola is a Gedola. So it makes absolute sense that Shmuel would require Amtana in the case of a Ketana who received a get. But the problem is, Amra Shmuel Chadazimna. Why would Shmuel repeat this a second time? He's already gone on record as making this ruling. The Amra Shmuel, Mianabo, Eina Tzricha Lahamtin Shlosh Chadash. In the case of a young girl who was married off by her brother or her mother, and then she was Mema'enes, Shmuel says, the coast is clear. She can get married immediately. However, Nosan lo get, if her husband decided to divorce her, in the case of Kedusha Miyun, Kedusha D'Rabbanan, because then it parallels the exact same case of a Gedola. So why would Shmuel feel compelled to repeat that which he already said? And now we're ready to turn to Daf Lamed Hey. Elo, says the Gemara, the truth is that Shmuel, you should be medayik from Shmuel Biznus, that a Ketana, if she had an escapade, right, a znus relationship, then she would have to wait 3 months before she could get married to see if maybe she became pregnant from that znus. The Gazur Rabbanon Ketana Mishum Gedola. And in the case of a Ketana who had a znus relationship, she'll have to wait to 3 months. Even though we know for sure she's not pregnant, she cannot get pregnant. And there's no havchana necessary, but nevertheless, there's Gzeira Mishum Gedola. Because in the case of a Ketana Shezinsa, she's in the identical situation as a Gedola Shezinsa. And if we forego the requirement of Hamtana of 3 Chadashim in the case of a Ketana Shezim, so we might mistakenly do the same thing in the case of a Gedola. However, Giores and Mechuchreres Ketana, that's where Shmuel was matir without Hamtana, because of the principle called Milsa de lo Shchicha lo Gazu Be'Rabbanan. And this is a very rare scenario that a girl who's so young undergoes gerus or shichrur, and she may have had a relationship such that we would require amtana. No, that's a gzeira d'Rabbanan in a milsa lo shchicha, and therefore lo gazru be'Rabbanan. But again, in a normal case of Be'ila, where we know that this Ketana had a znus relationship, the possibility is that if we allow it in a case of a Ketana, they might come to allow it in a case of a Gedola. When I say allow it, meaning to allow her to get married immediately. So the Gemara asks, "Umigazrina Ketana mishum Gedola v'atanan." At this point, in the development of the Sugya, the Gemara goes back to our Mishnah in a case where 2 men married 2 women, and there was a terrible mix-up, and each of the men had a relationship with actually the wife of his friend, And the Mishnah requires that we separate for 3 months until we can establish the marriage. And on this it says, Im hayu ktanos she'ein ruyas leled machzirin osan miyad. If this swap happened in a case of a ktana, we can allow them to get married immediately. Not married, they're already married, but I mean to say that each woman will go back to her rightful husband. And we see here that there's no gzera of ktana atu gedola. So Gemara answers, Amarav Gidol Amarav, Horash Shah Haisa. The Mishnah, in that case of a swap, gave a special license to allow each girl to go back to her rightful husband because of the pressing need of the hour. It was simply not a ruling, because as a matter of universal ruling, we would require Avchana, but because the situation was so pressing, it was so sensitive, that they allowed overriding this Gzera for the sake of, let's call it Shalom Bayis or Shalom Shnei Batim. So the Gemara says, Michlal Dahavoy. Wait a second. Let's read the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say Maisa B'Shnayim Shekidchu. And whenever the Mishnah wants to tell you about a Rosh Shah in a particular event that transpired at a specific moment in time, it opens up with the word Maisa. But here in our Mishnah, it says Shnayim Shekidchu. We're not telling a story here. We're organizing or formulating a ruling, a psak halacha. Ella says the Gemara, we have to backtrack a little bit. Elakehoros shah paisa. That in a case of shnayim shekidchu, the psak is, let's treat it as if there were a horosh shah. And why is that? V'chiluf lo shriach. Since this whole swapping situation where the wrong wife went to the wrong husband is so rare, that in the case of a ketana, who we know did not get pregnant, we waive the requirement of havchana, of hamtana, because it's a milsad lo shchicha. So we have to sort of pile up one thing on top of the other. It's like a piggy bank. It's number one, a gzera d'Rabbanan in a case of chiluf, which in itself is lo shchiach, and therefore we're going to treat it as if there was a rasha, and we're going to waive the requirement of habdan. Mishnah Achrina Amrilo, we have another transmission of the words of Shmuel. Amar Shmuel, Kulon, any woman who had be'ilah, tzrichos lahamtin shlosha chadashim, we will not let her get married without waiting 3 months. Chutz migiores umishachrores gidola. And now, according to the second transmission of Shmuel, it's not chutz migiores umishachrores ketana, but rather chutz migiores umishachrores gidola. We changed ketana into gidola in the second Lishna. So the Gemara now is medayek from the language of Shmuel when he says skulon trichas lahamtin. He means gedolos because he says chutz migioris and mitzachreres gedola. So basically, Shmuel had all the cases of a gedola in front of him, and he writes that in all those cases, they require amtana, except for these two exceptions of Giores and Meshuchreres. Aval Ketana, but the implication is that if he had in front of him all the cases of Gedola, and he deliberately omitted Ketana, his Bas Yisrael, Eina Tzricha Lahamtin Shloshech Hadosh, but a Ketana does not require amtana. Let's again go through the whole Shaklavitaria. What is the case you're talking about? We already quoted Shmuel earlier saying that if a Ma'anis doesn't require Amtana Shloshech Hadoshim, why would he feel compelled to repeat himself? And you're telling me that in a get case, because she's a ketana, she doesn't require hamtana. The ibegeta Amar Shmuel Debaya. We saw already a statement. We'll repeat it again. Shmuel says that there's a difference between my NS and Nizgarsha beget. The Amar Shmuel Mianabo Eno Tzrichalam Titzol Shechadashim. Here we're not going to accept the Gzera of Ketana Atu Gedola because there's no parallel in a Gedola of Miyun. There is the enterprise of Miyun doesn't exist vis-a-vis a Gedola, but Nasan Laget, where the circumstances of the Ketana are identical to that of a Gedola, except for the age difference, is Tzrichalam Titzol Shechadashim. So how could Shmuel possibly give us the impression here, by implication at least, that in the case of a Ketana, where she got to get, she doesn't need Hamtana? Shmuel's gone record to saying that a Ketana Nizgarsha needs Havchana, needs Hamtana. Ella, says the Gemara, that which you implied, you inferred, I should say, from Shmuel, that a Ketana does not need Hamtana, that's a case of Znus. And Znus B'Ketana lo Shchiach. Normally we would have a Gzera of Ketana Atu Gedola, and that's certainly going to apply if she received a get to bust up the marriage. But in a case of Znus, we're not going to require Havchana because it's a Milsa lo Shchicha. Now we have a principle, Milsa lo Shchicha lo Gazur Bei Rabbanan. So the Gemara asks, wait a second. You're telling me the reason why they didn't make this Kesera in the case of a Ketana is because Nus B'Ketana lo Shchicha. So what are we going to do with Gioris and Meshukreres? The Shchiach who's Nus is Ligzar. We should certainly have a Gzera of requiring a Havchana in the case of a Ketana who's a Gioris and a Meshukreres because Nus is Shchiach. So why would Shmuel be matir in the cases of Gioris and Meshukreres to allow them to get remarried without Avchana? Certainly Znus is Shchia. And the Gemara answers, Hu Diyama ki Rabbi Yossi. So now at this point, the Gemara is introducing Rabbi Yossi. The Sanya. Now first we're going to start with the dissenting view of Rabbi Yossi. The Bar Pluk, that's Rabbi Yehuda. And then we'll get to Rabbi Yossi. Hagioris v'ashmuya v'ashivcha sheniftu v'nisgayru v'nishtachru tzrichos la'amtin shlosh chadoshim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda is applying the principle of Gazrinon Ketana Otu Gedola. And if you tell me it's a case of Znus, then apparently Rabbi Yehuda holds that here it's a Znus that's Shchia. And Rabbi Yossi matil yoris linosi miyad. So that Rabbi Yossi holds that we don't have to worry about pregnancy. And Znus is not an issue. The entire halachic institution of Havchana, requiring Havchana, was not made in a case of Znus. It was only in a marriage framework. And that's the sheep of Rabbi Yossi. Omar Rav, my time into Rabbi Yossi. What about a woman who had a relationship outside of the marriage, the framework of marriage? Why aren't we worried about Havchana? Maybe she got pregnant. So the next line in the Gemara is reminiscent of something from Hollywood in our contemporary times. And the Gemara says, "Kasavra isha mizana mishameshes b'moch kidei shelo tisaber," which basically means, if I could say it in crude terms, that when a woman has an illicit relationship, she'll use, we would call it today a diaphragm. They called it a moch, but it's the same idea. She doesn't want to get pregnant. She wants to have fun. Maybe she's being paid. I don't know what's going on here, but she has this loose relationship. And mishameshes b'moch. Now, you and I might ask whether moch is a very reliable method of contraception, but we're assuming now that we can rely on moch. She's not pregnant.
Right.
Amalei Abaye, Bishle Megiores, you could tell me that in the case of a Giores, she doesn't need Hamton of Gimel Chadoshim payment the Daite Ligure. She is already anticipating Gerus. She's in a class, it's a year's training course for Gerim. Is Minter and Nafshi. She'll definitely take the proper precautions to make sure and guarantee she doesn't become pregnant. She certainly wants to know whether or not she's pregnant, because in event that she's pregnant before she passes the course and undergoes gerus, then the child is shelo b'kedusha, which might mean that the child will require its own gerus. So she wants to make sure that she's not mixing up the zera here, that this zera is not from a guy, from shelo b'kedusha. So she uses a mo. And you can apply the same logic to shvuya v'shifta nami, right? These are women that are anticipating returning to the fold, so to speak, or joining the fold of Israel. And to Shamei Nafshayu, they will be very careful. And Mintrei Nafshayu, they'll watch and guard themselves, protect themselves. At Chas Tashmish, they are wearing a moch. Ella. Well, what about the following case? The case of a shivcha who went free, not because the master one day decided to be meshacher her, but he was required, according to Jewish law, to give her get shechur. Why? Because she's yotzeis b'shein v'ayin. If he took out her tooth or her eye, which is obviously a surprise situation, it wasn't anticipated, and she didn't know beforehand that this was going to happen, so why do you assume that she would have taken precautions by using a moch? If she anticipated, well, I'm going to be miskayir, etc., then it makes sense for her to use a moch, but not in the case of all of a sudden he hits her over the head. Is therefore, how can you tell me that she's very careful to watch and guard herself, that she shouldn't get pregnant, and she uses a moch? She doesn't know that she's going to get freed. She was freed because of an unanticipated episode. And if you'll tell me, called to Mimela Moder of Yossi, in any case that something happened which was not anticipated, like, for example, Yotzeis B'Shein V'Ayin, she didn't know that she would get clobbered, and therefore she'd be Mishtachrer, is Rabbi Yossi would concede that in such a case we require 3 Chadoshim of Hamtana, because she wasn't using what? Contraception. For Tan, we learned in the Mishnah, Anusa, and again, we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda now, and then we'll get to Rabbi Yossi. Anusa mefuta tzricha lahamtin shlosha chadoshim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now, in a case of mefuta, you could say that she knows what's going on, and beforehand she protected herself, prepared herself. But in the case of an anusa, I mean, she wasn't expecting this onus to take place. And therefore, it makes sense that Rabbi Yehuda would require Hamtana Gimel Chadoshim. She didn't use a moch. And yet, Rabbi Yossi Matil Yareseli Nase Miyad. So it seems that Rabbi Yossi, even in the case of Anutza, where she couldn't have possibly anticipated this onus situation, and she couldn't have prepared herself for Tashmish by putting a moch inside her body, right? Onus is something that happens, takes you by surprise. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yossi says she doesn't need a hamton of gimel chadashim. Why? I mean, she's not protecting herself. She never anticipated having this intimacy. It was a rape situation. Why shouldn't she require hamton of gimel chadashim? Elo Amar Abaye. Abaye says, let's disregard our current explanation for Rabbi Yossi of Mishameshes B'mo. That's not what motivates Rabbi Yossi. But rather, Rabbi Yossi had a psychology about znus. We touched on it a little earlier. Isha mizana, but not pre-intercourse, because again, then we're stuck with the case of ones, but rather post-intercourse. She can prevent herself from becoming pregnant after the Ma'aseh Bila. How? Mishapeches. Kidei shelo tis'aber. She can immediately turn over and somehow cause the zera to be expelled from her uterus in a way that she won't get pregnant. Again, you and I would say that's not the most foolproof method of contraception, but nevertheless, Rabbi Yossi accepts this as a rule. Any woman who doesn't want to get pregnant because of a case of znus, she will turn over in such a way. She didn't put a moch into her body, but she wants to get rid of the zera. And that's a very easy thing to do. It's not a great tircha. So she'll be careful not to get pregnant. So therefore she doesn't need gimel chadashim. So the entire enterprise of the Gzeira D'Rabbanan of requiring hamtana was not instituted, according to Rabbi Yossi, in cases of znus. The idach, what about Rabbi Yehuda? He says that she requires gimel chadashim. Why not apply the principle of mishapeches? She may become pregnant, and she didn't do such a great job of shaking all the zera out of her body. Now, the Mishnah had stated that in this case of a swap, im hayu kohanos nifsalu min hatruma. If either of these two women were kohanos, and a bas kohen is allowed to eat truma, by virtue of the fact that she had a relationship of an Eishes Ish, a znus of Eishes Ish, she is posel psula min hakahuna, and therefore she can no longer eat truma. So the Gemara is medayik from the Mishnah. What are you telling me? Kohenos in? You're talking about a bas kohen? What about the Yisraelis? Let's say a girl from any shevet you like marries a Kohen. The law is that she can eat truma unless she became posel l'kuhun. And if she had this extramarital relationship, again, albeit not with any intention, it was not deliberate on her own part, but nevertheless she had the beer, that passes her for kahuna. So why are you telling me that this halacha applies to a kohen, only to a kohenes, as if to imply that it doesn't apply to Yisraelis? Now, I mentioned truma, but actually the Mishnah touches on an even more fundamental issue about whether she can go back and be married to her husband. And the answer is that she becomes psula l'kuhuna. And why? Because she's a kohenes? That doesn't make any sense. Even in Israel, it's a bas Yisrael. If she was married off to a